A photograph of three Nazi soldiers captured a moment frozen in time, preserving expressions and details that would remain hidden for decades. The image, seemingly ordinary at first glance, contained secrets that only modern technology could reveal. When experts finally examined the photograph with advanced digital tools 75 years later, what they discovered left them completely stunned. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The afternoon sky hung grey and heavy over Berlin as Anna Müller pushed open the creaking door to the National Archives' basement storage. The young intern navigated through narrow aisles of metal shelving, her footsteps echoing against concrete floors. This was her third week cataloguing forgotten documents, a task most of her colleagues avoided. "Find anything interesting yet, Doctor?" Matthias Weber's voice startled her. The archive director stood in the doorway, his tall frame silhouetted against the fluorescent hallway light. "Just dust and bureaucracy so far," Anna replied, lifting the heavy iron chest she'd discovered tucked behind decades of administrative records. The lock had already been broken, perhaps years ago during a previous abandoned cataloging attempt. The chest groaned as she raised its lid, revealing stacks of yellowed papers inside. "Doctor," Weber approached with the practiced indifference of someone who had seen thousands of similar documents, requisition forms, inventory lists, the mundane paperwork of history. "I'll check back in an hour," he said, already turning to leave. "Remember to wear gloves with anything pre-1960, Anna nodded, pulling on the thin cotton gloves from her pocket. She began methodically sorting through the contents, placing each document in chronological order on the work table beside her. Requisition forms, personnel files, inventory lists, exactly what Dr. Weber had predicted. Then she found it. Between two folders of supply records, a black and white photograph slipped out. Unlike the official documentation surrounding it, this image wasn't neatly labeled or categorized. It seemed out of place, almost as if someone had hidden it intentionally. Three soldiers in crisp uniforms stood in a row, their posture rigid and formal. Before them knelt several civilians, heads bowed. There was something unsettling about the composition, too staged, too deliberate to be a spontaneous moment captured by chance. Anna felt a strange, prickling sensation across her skin. While she'd handled dozens of historical photographs during her internship, something about this particular image seemed to pulse with untold significance. She turned it over, searching for dates, names, anything. But the back was blank. When Dr. Weber returned precisely 58 minutes later, he found Anna still standing at the table, the photograph held carefully between her gloved fingers. "Dr. Weber," she said without looking up, "I think I've found something important." The director approached with his usual skepticism, prepared to explain why yet another document was merely routine paperwork. But when he saw the intensity in the intern's eyes as she studied the image, something shifted in his expression. For the first time since Anna had begun her internship, the seasoned archivist seemed genuinely intrigued. "This," he said quietly, "might not be just another piece for the collection." Anna Müller stared at the photograph, her eyes tracing every detail. Three German soldiers stood in perfect formation, their uniforms immaculate and pressed, boots gleaming even in the faded black and white image. What struck her wasn't their rigid posture or stern expressions, but the stark contrast they created against the backdrop. "This doesn't make sense," she whispered, more to herself than to Dr. Matthias Weber, who hovered nearby. Before the soldiers knelt 5 civilians, 3 women and 2 men, heads bowed, hands clasped together as if in prayer. Their expressions were hidden, but their posture spoke volumes about their fear. Yet the setting was jarringly incongruous with the implied violence of the scene. The photograph captured a peaceful street that could have been from any small German town. Wooden fences lined the cobblestone road, and window boxes overflowed with flowers outside what appeared to be a bakery. A bicycle leaned casually against a lamppost, It looked like a scene from a peaceful Sunday afternoon, violently interrupted by the uniformed men. "The composition is too perfect," Anna murmured. Running her fingertips across the aged paper, the texture felt rough beneath her touch, the photograph having developed a slight curl at the edges from decades of storage. Dr. Weber adjusted his glasses. Many propaganda photos were staged during that period. "But this wasn't meant for propaganda," she replied. "This was filed away, not published. And look at how the civilians are positioned. It's almost theatrical." The young intern couldn't shake the feeling that something was profoundly wrong with the image. The soldiers stood too straight, their shadows falling at precise angles across the kneeling figures. The civilians, despite their submissive posture, seemed arranged rather than naturally cowering. The entire scene resembled a macabre play where everyone had been assigned their roles. "It's like a performance," Anna said, leaning closer, "as if they're all trapped in some dark theater production." The silence in the archive room grew heavier as she studied the photograph. Even the dust particles suspended in the afternoon light seemed to pause, as if the gravity of the image commanded stillness. The more she examined it, the more questions emerged. Why this location? Why these particular civilians? She wondered aloud. Dr. Weber offered no answers, his initial skepticism giving way to curiosity. The photograph held secrets that conventional historical accounts hadn't captured, a moment frozen in time that challenged everything they thought they knew about how terror operated in everyday spaces during the war. Anna carefully placed the photograph on the scanner bed. Whatever truth lay hidden in this image, she was determined to uncover it, no matter how disturbing it might prove to be. "Just another case of civilian intimidation," declared the senior archivist, stamping the photograph with the official classification. The Berlin National Archive had thousands of similar images from the war. Soldiers asserting dominance over civilians was hardly novel, but Anna Müller couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. She studied the photograph again, tracing her finger over the soldiers' faces. Their expressions seemed too rigid, almost rehearsed. The uniforms were impeccably pressed, as if prepared specifically for this moment. And the civilians, why were they kneeling in front of a bakery, of all places? "There's something more here," she whispered to herself, earning a curious glance from a colleague at the neighboring desk. That evening, Anna approached Dr. Otto Braun, her direct supervisor. The older man looked up from his computer, his reading glasses perched on the tip of his nose. "Dr. Braun, I need permission to use the high-resolution scanner for this photograph," she said, placing the image on his desk. "The high-res scanner," he repeated, frowning. "That equipment is reserved for priority artifacts. This has already been classified." Anna stood her ground. "I believe there are details we're missing. The positioning of the soldiers, the location. It doesn't match typical intimidation scenarios from that period." Dr. Braun studied her face, then the photograph. Though initially reluctant, something about the young intern's determination intrigued him. After 25 years at the archive, he'd developed an instinct for meaningful discoveries. "You have 1 hour with the scanner tomorrow morning," he finally said, "before regular hours. I'll authorize it." Anna couldn't wait until morning. She returned to the archive after dinner, using her access card to enter the quiet building. The security guard merely nodded. Late nights weren't uncommon for dedicated staff. The high-resolution scanner hummed to life in the technology room. Anna placed the photograph carefully on the glass surface, adjusting the settings to capture the finest details. The machine worked methodically, creating digital layers that could be enhanced and examined. Hour after hour, she zoomed in on different sections of the image: the soldiers, insignias, the civilians, clothing, the buildings in the background. Her eyes burned from staring at the screen, but she refused to stop. By 3 in the morning, Anna had created dozens of enhanced segments. She studied the soldiers' faces, looking for any clue that might explain the strange scene. The civilians' expressions revealed more fear than seemed appropriate for a routine check. And those uniforms, they were ceremonial grade, not typical field wear. When the security guard found her asleep at the workstation at dawn, the screen still displayed a zoomed-in portion of the photograph, a detail so small it had been invisible to the naked eye, yet so significant it would change everything they thought they knew. It was then, while examining the photograph for the third consecutive hour, that Anna Müller noticed something hidden among the flowers and wooden fence planks. Her eyes caught a faded inscription, barely visible in the background. Bäckerei Grunwald. The young intern's heart raced as she realized this could be the first tangible connection to a real location. "Dr. Braun, look at this," she called to her supervisor, who had been observing her work from across the archive room. Otto Braun adjusted his glasses and leaned closer to the high-resolution scan. His initial reluctance had gradually given way to curiosity about Anna's determination. "A bakery name," he muttered. Good catch." Anna immediately began searching through the digital archives, her fingers flying across the keyboard. After cross-referencing historical business registries with geographical databases, she discovered something remarkable. A bakery with that exact name still operated in the small town of Ichenheim in southern Germany. "It's still there," she whispered, almost to herself. "After 75 years. The contrast between the implicit violence in the photograph and the simplicity of the location deeply disturbed her. That quiet street corner, where today people bought fresh bread and apple cakes, had once been a stage for the silent terror captured in the black and white image. Lives had been forever marked in front of that bakery, ordinary German citizens forced to kneel before uniformed men with cold expressions. Dr. Braun studied the young intern's face. "This changes our understanding of the photograph's context," he acknowledged. "It's no longer just an anonymous scene of intimidation." Anna nodded, feeling a chill despite the archive's warmth. The bakery's continued existence created an unsettling bridge between past and present. History textbooks had documented the grand atrocities, the massive camps, the infamous locations. But here was evidence of how terror had infiltrated the most mundane corners of everyday life, places that had simply continued existing afterward, as if nothing had happened. "I need to find out who these people were," Anna said, pointing to the kneeling civilians. They weren't just random victims. They had names, lives, and connections to this specific place. The discovery transformed the photograph from a generic historical document into something far more personal and disturbing. This wasn't just about documenting Nazi intimidation tactics anymore. It was about uncovering a specific incident that had somehow remained invisible to official history for decades. "I'll request access to the municipal records for Ichenheim," Dr. Braun offered, his professional interest now fully engaged. "If we're going to pursue this, we should be thorough." Anna nodded gratefully, her eyes returning to the faded bakery sign in the photograph. What other secrets might this image be hiding in plain sight? Anna Müller couldn't keep the discovery to herself any longer. With the photograph burning a hole in her thoughts, she sought out Marta Klein, the archive's genealogist, known for her skeptical approach to historical claims. The two women had exchanged polite nods in the hallways before, but had never worked closely together. "I need your expertise," Anna said, spreading the photograph on Marta's desk. "There's something about these people that doesn't fit the official narrative." Marta adjusted her glasses, studying the image with practiced precision. Though initially dismissive, her expression changed as Anna explained the bakery connection and her suspicions. "Let's cross-reference the family records," the genealogist suggested, her skepticism giving way to professional curiosity. "If these people lived on that street in 1944, there should be documentation." For the next 3 days, the two women immersed themselves in dusty records and digital archives. They pulled residence permits, census data, and local government files from Ichenheim. What emerged was deeply troubling. "Look at this pattern," Anna pointed to a spreadsheet they'd created. Most families were classified as racially pure Germans, according to Nazi standards. But these households, She indicated several names with her finger. Have strange notations. Marta nodded grimly. Origin questionable, she read aloud. Undesirable mixing, suspect loyalties. The vague, bureaucratic language masked human tragedies. These weren't Jewish families or other targeted minorities, Anna continued. They were Germans who simply didn't fit perfectly into the regime's rigid categories. The genealogist pulled up another document, a neighborhood assessment from 1943. This family had a grandmother from Poland. This one had relatives who opposed Hitler early on. And this household, she paused, the father once defended a Jewish business partner. So the regime wasn't just targeting obvious enemies, Anna whispered. They were creating divisions within German society itself. The women worked late into the evening, piecing together a narrative that contradicted the black-and-white version of history many still clung to. The past was revealing itself in shades of grey, neighbours turning against neighbours, arbitrary classifications determining fates. This changes everything about how we understand the photograph, Marta said, her initial skepticism completely gone. These weren't random acts of intimidation. This was systematic control through fear, even among those who should have been safe by Nazi standards. Anna nodded, feeling a chill despite the archive's warmth. The narrative we've been taught is too simple. The reality was much more insidious. No one was truly safe if they stepped even slightly out of line. The two women, now united in purpose, continued their meticulous documentation, knowing they were uncovering a forgotten chapter of history that many might prefer to leave buried. What surprised Anna Müller most was the testimony of a survivor, Günther Schneider. At 89 years old, the elderly man's hands trembled as he recounted the soldiers' visits to Bäckerei Grünwald. His voice, though weakened by age, carried the weight of memories that had haunted him for 3/4 of a century. We were all neighbours before, Günther explained, eyes fixed on a distant point as if watching ghosts from the past. Then suddenly, friends became suspects. The baker's wife, her grandmother was from Poland, they made her kneel in the street while her children watched. Anna leaned forward in her chair, recording every word as the old man described how ordinary life in Eckenheim had transformed overnight. The soldiers would arrive unannounced, sometimes smiling, sometimes stern, but always methodical in their intimidation. They came with lists, he continued. Names, dates, supposed infractions, even having coffee with the wrong person could put you on that list. What struck the young intern most profoundly was the confusion in Günther's account. These weren't tales of concentration camps or mass executions. These were stories of everyday terror, of wondering if your neighbor would report you for an offhand comment, or if your family history contained some impurity that might be discovered. The worst part wasn't the soldiers, he said, his voice dropping to nearly a whisper. It was not knowing who among us had reported whom. Trust died before people did. The human dimension of the investigation suddenly overwhelmed Anna. These weren't just historical subjects or case studies. They were people who had lived through systematic betrayal, whose communities had been fractured by fear and suspicion. Günther showed her a faded photograph of his family standing outside the bakery before the war. This is what they took from us, he said, not just lives. They took our trust in each other. As she thanked the elderly man for sharing his story, Anna felt an almost suffocating empathy wash over her. The academic detachment she'd maintained throughout her internship at the National Archive crumbled. These forgotten stories deserved to be heard, to be documented, to be remembered. On the train back to Berlin, Anna stared at her notes, determination hardening within her. The photograph wasn't just evidence of historical events. It was proof of how easily communities could be turned against themselves, how fear could transform neighbors into enemies. She would give voice to these silenced histories, no matter what resistance she might face at the archive. Some truths, Anna realized, were too important to remain buried in dusty boxes and institutional indifference. The National Archive Administration was growing increasingly uncomfortable with Anna Müller's persistence in investigating a photograph they considered already classified. Dr. Matthias Weber paced his office, the weight of institutional pressure evident in his furrowed brow. Earlier that morning, he'd received 3 separate calls from board members expressing concern about the young intern's project. "Anna, I understand your enthusiasm," he said, sliding a stack of folders across his desk, "but perhaps these cataloguing tasks would be more appropriate for someone at your level. The photograph has already been processed according to protocol." The young intern nodded politely, but the determined glint in her eyes remained unchanged. She took the folders without argument, knowing that open defiance would only make matters worse. That evening, long after her colleagues had departed, Anna returned to the dimly lit archive basement. The security guard, accustomed to her late hours, merely nodded as she passed. The basement had become her second home, a sanctuary where forgotten voices seemed to whisper from every dusty shelf. "They want me to stop," she murmured to herself, carefully extracting a torn letter from its protective sleeve. "But how can I when these people have waited 75 years to be heard?" Night after night, Ina meticulously pieced together fragments of the past, partial correspondence between military officers, torn resident lists, and hastily scribbled notes that had somehow escaped destruction. Each document, no matter how insignificant it appeared, might contain the missing connection she sought. Dr. Otto Braun occasionally observed her work from afar, impressed by her methodical approach despite his initial reservations. The supervisor had seen many ambitious young researchers come and go, but something about Anna's quiet determination struck him as different. She wasn't seeking academic glory, but truth. One particularly late evening, Anna discovered a partial census record listing families from Ichenheim. Several names had been crossed out with red ink, while others bore cryptic annotations. She carefully photographed each page with her device, adding them to her growing digital collection. "Adieu, the everyday brutality," she whispered, tracing a finger over a notation beside a family name. It wasn't just in concentration camps or battlefields. It was on ordinary streets, in bakeries, in living rooms. The institutional resistance only strengthened her resolve. While her colleagues processed routine acquisitions during daylight hours, Anna built her case in the shadows. Each fragment she uncovered, a military directive, a civilian complaint, a supply requisition, added another piece to the puzzle of what had truly happened on that street in Ichenheim. As weeks passed, her apartment walls became covered with timelines, connections, and theories, a physical manifestation of her refusal to let bureaucracy bury history a second time. The breakthrough came on a rainy Tuesday morning. Ina Müller had convinced the archival department to run the photograph through their newly installed facial recognition software, technology typically reserved for high-priority government projects. The small team gathered around her computer screen, breath held collectively as the program analyzed the 3 uniformed men standing proudly above the kneeling civilians. "We have matches," Anna whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the machine. The results appeared methodically. 2 of the soldiers had been identified in military databases, not as heroes, but as men who had faced disciplinary action from their own regime for improper conduct. The 3rd soldier, Hans Bauer, had seemingly vanished from all records after the photograph was taken. Dr. Otto Braun leaned closer to the screen, adjusting his glasses. "This changes everything," he muttered. "Why would soldiers who had fallen from grace be participating in what appears to be an official action, and why document it?" The small research team exchanged bewildered glances. Marta Klein, who had been skeptical at first, now stood with her arms crossed tightly against her chest, her expression grave. Either they were following orders despite their status, or this wasn't an official operation at all. Anna finished her thought. The implications hung heavy in the air. These men might have been acting independently, perhaps even against orders. The genealogist pulled up additional files she had been compiling. The timing matches. These disciplinary actions occurred just weeks after this photograph was taken. What if what we're seeing here led to their punishment? Word of their discovery spread quickly through the National Archive. By afternoon, colleagues who had previously avoided eye contact with Anna now lingered near her desk, hungry for details. The atmosphere shifted palpably. Some staff members expressed concern about pursuing such a sensitive investigation, while others offered quiet support. Dr. Matthias Weber called an emergency meeting, his face ashen. "I've received 3 calls from journalists already. Someone is leaking information." He looked pointedly around the room. "This institution's reputation is at stake." "With all due respect," Anna countered, "isn't historical truth our primary obligation?" That evening, Berlin's most respected newspaper ran a small but provocative headline: "National Archive uncovers possible rogue Nazi operations." The article was frustratingly vague, but it was enough to send shockwaves through academic circles. As Anna packed her belongings to leave, she found a note slipped under her keyboard. "My grandfather was from Ickenheim. Please don't stop." It wasn't signed, but it reminded her why this mattered. Beyond academic interest, beyond institutional politics, real people, real lives had been affected by whatever had happened on that quiet street in 1944. The mystery of Hans Bauer, the vanished third soldier, now loomed larger than ever. Marta Klein spread the documents across the table, her hands trembling slightly as she pointed to the names she'd uncovered. "These women weren't Jewish, Roma, or any other persecuted minority," she explained to Anna. "They were ethnic Germans, families with bloodlines that could be traced back generations in Ickenheim." Anna Müller leaned forward, studying the genealogical charts the older woman had meticulously compiled. The revelation struck her like a physical blow. The kneeling women in the photograph, those she had assumed were victims of racial persecution, were actually considered pure Germans by the regime's own twisted standards. "Then why were they being punished?" Anna whispered, her finger tracing the faded image. The genealogist sighed heavily. "Because purity wasn't enough. Look at these notations." She slid forward several yellowed index cards with handwritten comments: "Questionable associations, mixed marriage and extended family, anonymous report of anti-party sentiment." One woman had been marked simply because her sister had married a French businessman before the war. Another because she'd been seen bringing food to an elderly neighbor whose son had deserted from military service. A third because someone had reported her for insufficient enthusiasm during a local party rally. The regime didn't just target obvious enemies, Marta explained, her professional detachment slipping as she organized the files. They created a system where anyone could become suspect overnight. A careless word, a missed donation to the party, even refusing to report a neighbor's indiscretion, all became grounds for punishment. Anna felt a chill as she realized the implications. The terror wasn't just directed outward, but inward, creating a society where Germans policed other Germans, where arbitrary suspicion replaced rule of law, where paranoia became policy. These weren't exceptional cases, the genealogist continued, gesturing toward a stack of similar records. The system needed enemies to function. When obvious targets weren't available, they simply created new categories of undesirables within their own population. Anna thought of Gunther Schneider's haunting words, "We were all neighbors." Suddenly, friends became suspects. The human cost of such a system became painfully clear. Communities fractured by suspicion, families torn apart by arbitrary accusations, lives destroyed by whispers. The most effective part of the terror, Marta said quietly, was its unpredictability. Anyone could be next. That's how they kept everyone in line. As they worked late into the evening, cataloguing these stories of internal persecution, Anna realized they weren't just uncovering historical footnotes. They were exposing the fundamental mechanism of how totalitarian control functions, not just through violence against obvious enemies, but through the systematic destruction of trust among ordinary citizens. The atmosphere at the National Archive had shifted dramatically. What began as a routine examination of old photographs had transformed into something far more consequential. Anna Müller could feel the weight of suspicious glances from colleagues as she walked through the corridors. Whispers followed her, some questioning her motives, others concerned about the institution's reputation if the investigation continued. "You're making powerful people nervous," a colleague warned her during lunch. "Some think you should leave history buried where it belongs." Anna clutched her research folder tighter, knowing that truth rarely came without resistance. Several senior archivists had begun avoiding her altogether, fearing association with what some were calling a controversial witch hunt. The young intern found herself increasingly isolated, eating lunch alone at her desk while reviewing documents rather than joining others in the break room. Dr. Otto Braun, however, had undergone a remarkable transformation. The supervisor, who had reluctantly allowed Anna to use the high-resolution scanner, now watched her work with growing respect. One evening, as the office emptied and shadows lengthened across the floor, he approached her desk. "What you've uncovered matters," he said quietly, glancing around to ensure they weren't overheard. "My father lived through those times." He spoke of neighbors who vanished overnight, not just Jews or dissidents, but ordinary Germans who somehow fell from favor. The following morning, Dr. Braun discreetly provided Anna with access codes to restricted archives. "There might be more documentation about Ickenheim here," he explained. "But be careful. Director Weber is under pressure from the board." Together, they formulated a plan. Anna would travel to the small southern town with Marta Klein, under the pretense of cataloging regional archives. The genealogist had proven herself an invaluable ally, her initial skepticism replaced by fierce determination. "We need to move quickly," Marta advised, as they prepared their travel documents. "I've heard rumors that certain government officials want this investigation quietly closed." Anna nodded, understanding the urgency. The photograph that had started everything now felt like a ticking clock. Every detail they uncovered seemed to challenge established narratives about how the Nazi regime operated within German communities. "If authorities intervene," Dr. Braun warned them before their departure, "we may lose access to these records forever." As Anna packed her research materials, she caught her reflection in the window, tired eyes but unwavering resolve. What had begun as professional curiosity had evolved into something more profound, a moral obligation to those silenced by history. The truth about those 3 soldiers and the kneeling civilians could no longer remain hidden, regardless of the personal cost. The cobblestone streets of Ickenheim welcomed Anna Müller and Marta Klein with a peculiar duality, the inviting aroma of fresh bread mingling with the heavy shadow of unspoken history. The 2 women from the National Archive walked slowly, their footsteps echoing against buildings that had witnessed decades of both ordinary life and extraordinary horror. "It feels surreal," Anna whispered, as they approached Bäckerei Grunwald. The bakery stood proudly at the corner, its cheerful blue awning and window display of pretzels and dark rye loaves creating an almost jarring contrast to the purpose of their visit. Inside, they were greeted by Klaus and Elsa Grunwald, grandchildren of the original owners. The siblings, now in their 60s, welcomed the researchers with cautious hospitality, offering coffee and apple strudel as they settled at a corner table away from customers. "Our grandfather rarely spoke of those days," Klaus explained, his weathered hands wrapped tightly around his mug. "But sometimes, after too much schnapps at Christmas, he would mention the visits, how soldiers would appear without warning, demanding to see papers, questioning loyalties." Elsa nodded, her eyes distant. The worst part wasn't the soldiers themselves, but how neighbors turned on each other. Anonymous reports could destroy a family overnight. "Our grandmother's best friend, A woman whose family had lived here for generations was suddenly labeled undesirable because someone claimed her great-grandmother might have been Jewish. Anna felt tears welling in her eyes as Elsa showed them faded photographs of townspeople, many whose descendants still lived nearby. The young archivist struggled to reconcile the peaceful town square visible through the window with the stories of public humiliation and fear. "And people still don't talk about it," Klaus continued. "There are families here who haven't spoken to each other since 1944, grudges and shame passed down like heirlooms." Marta, who had been quietly taking notes, finally spoke. "Were there any acts of resistance? Anyone who stood against what was happening?" The siblings exchanged a meaningful glance before Elsa disappeared into the back room. She returned with a small, worn, leather-bound book. "Our grandfather's delivery records," she explained. "Look closely at these addresses. He delivered extra bread to certain homes, families under suspicion, and recorded it as waste in the official logs." Anna ran her fingers over the faded ink, feeling an overwhelming connection to these small, dangerous acts of kindness. In that moment, the genealogist and the young archivist understood that their work wasn't just about historical accuracy, it was about restoring dignity to those whose names had been deliberately erased, whose stories had been systematically silenced for 3 generations. As they left the bakery, the weight of responsibility felt heavier than ever. The peaceful afternoon streets of Ekenheim held secrets that deserved, finally, to be spoken aloud. Back in Berlin, Ina Müller faced a storm brewing within the National Archives walls. Headlines about a scandal at the National Archive had begun circulating in local papers, catching the attention of senior officials. The young intern's discovery had transcended from historical curiosity to potential institutional crisis. "Ms. Müller, the board requires your presence tomorrow at 9, Dr. Matthias Weber announced, his voice strained as he handed her the formal notice. "They want a complete explanation of your findings and methodology." Anna nodded, feeling her throat tighten. The possibility of termination loomed large, threatening not just her career, but the truth she'd uncovered. That night, she carefully organized her evidence, photographs, documents, testimonies, knowing her entire professional future hung in the balance. "They're frightened of what you found," Dr. Otto Braun told her quietly when they met in the empty break room. The supervisor's support had grown from reluctant permission to genuine alliance. "But remember, historical truth matters more than institutional comfort." Meanwhile, Dr. Weber paced his office until midnight, torn between conflicting loyalties. As director, he dedicated 20 years to building the archive's reputation as Germany's most trusted historical institution. Yet, as a historian, he recognized the profound importance of Anna's discovery. Sleep eluded him night after night as he rehearsed arguments for both protecting and exposing the truth. The archive's atmosphere had transformed dramatically. Colleagues who once shared coffee with Anna now avoided eye contact in hallways. Whispered conversations stopped when she entered rooms. Some staff members openly questioned whether a mere intern should be handling such sensitive historical material. "And they're treating you like you've committed treason instead of doing your job," Marta Klein remarked bitterly as they reviewed documents together. The genealogist had become Anna's staunchest ally, staying late to help prepare for the board meeting. Security guards began checking identification more stringently. Confidential memos circulated among senior staff. The weight of 75 years of buried history pressed down on everyone involved, creating an environment of suspicion reminiscent of the very era they were investigating. Anna spent her evening rehearsing her presentation, her apartment walls covered with timeline charts and photocopied evidence. The photograph of the 3 soldiers and kneeling civilians stared back at her, a silent testament to historical truths that powerful institutions often preferred to keep buried. "Whatever happens tomorrow," she told herself, studying the faces in the image, These people deserved to have their story told. The fear of losing her position remained real, but the responsibility of revealing long-suppressed truths felt heavier still. The discovery came at the moment when tensions at the National Archive were at their highest. Anna Müller's hands trembled as she carefully unfolded the yellowed paper that had been tucked away in the iron chest for decades. It was an internal SS letter, marked with the distinctive lightning bolt insignia that still sent chills down the spines of those who understood its implications. "This can't be right," she whispered, her voice barely audible in the silent archive room. Dr. Otto Braun leaned over her shoulder, adjusting his glasses as he scanned the document. The supervisor's usually composed demeanor faltered as he processed what they were reading. The letter detailed explicit instructions for a public correction event, targeting what the SS called corrupted elements within the German community itself. They were punishing their own people, Anna said, the realization washing over her like ice water. The photograph wasn't documenting the persecution of outside minorities as initially assumed. It showed German citizens being humiliated for minor infractions against Nazi ideology. The letter specified that the kneeling civilians in the photograph were all ethnically German families, suspected of harboring impure thoughts or showing insufficient enthusiasm for the regime. Some had relatives who had made critical remarks about Hitler. Others had failed to participate in mandatory community events. One family's only crime was refusing to report their neighbors for listening to foreign radio broadcasts. Marta Klein arrived just as they were translating the most damning paragraph. The genealogist's face paled as she read over the specific instructions for the correction ceremony at Bäckerei Grunwald. "This changes everything," Marta said, her professional skepticism completely dissolved. "It proves the regime didn't just target outsiders. They terrorized anyone who didn't conform perfectly to their vision." The revelation hit the small research team like an explosion. The Nazi regime's paranoia ran deeper than most historical accounts acknowledged. It wasn't simply about racial ideology, it was about absolute control, turning neighbors against each other, making examples of ordinary Germans who showed even the slightest resistance. Dr. Matthias Weber was summoned immediately. The director's face grew increasingly grave as he reviewed the evidence. "This will cause an international stir," he said, running his hand through his graying hair. "It contradicts the simplified narrative many have accepted about that period." Anna thought of Gunther Schneider's words about confusion and fear. Now they made perfect sense. The 89-year-old survivor hadn't been describing the persecution of outsiders. He had been recalling how the regime turned ordinary Germans against each other, creating an atmosphere where no one felt safe, not even those who believed themselves protected by their German heritage. "The world needs to know this truth," Anna insisted, her voice finding new strength. "This wasn't just about persecution of minorities. It was about a system that would destroy anyone, even its own people, to maintain control." The emergency council meeting at the National Archive was called to order at 9 in the morning. Dr. Matthias Weber sat at the head of the oval table, his face a mask of professional neutrality despite the tension filling the room. 12 senior archivists had gathered to determine the fate of the photograph and its associated documents. "This discovery could damage diplomatic relations," argued the head of international affairs, tapping nervously on the polished wood. "We must consider the broader implications before rushing to publication." Anna Müller stood beside the projector, the enlarged photograph displayed behind her. She had rehearsed her arguments all night, knowing this moment might define her career, and more importantly, the legacy of those in the image. "These people deserve to have their story told," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "For 75 years, their suffering has been buried in our basement." Marta Klein nodded supportively from across the room. The genealogist had prepared detailed family trees of those identified in the photograph. showing how the Nazi regime had systematically erased their existence from official records. This isn't just about historical accuracy, Dr. Otto Braun added, surprising many with his vocal support. It's about acknowledging that the terror wasn't limited to concentration camps. It happened on ordinary streets, in front of bakeries, to people deemed pure German until someone decided otherwise. The debate grew heated. One archivist slammed his palm on the table, arguing that releasing the materials would only provide ammunition to extremist groups. Another worried about lawsuits from descendants of the soldiers. And what about the descendants of the victims? Anna countered. Don't they deserve to know what happened to their grandparents? Dr. Weber raised his hand for silence. We need to consider all angles. This institution has a responsibility to historical truth, but also to the potential consequences of revelation. The council remained deadlocked after 3 hours of deliberation. Some members refused to vote without consulting legal experts. Others insisted on immediate disclosure. As the meeting adjourned without resolution, Anna felt a crushing disappointment. In the hallway, she overheard whispered conversations. Some colleagues avoided eye contact, while others offered subtle nods of support. They're afraid, Marta whispered, joining her at the water cooler. But fear is exactly what kept these stories buried for so long. The tension had reached a breaking point. Staff members chose sides, some arguing passionately in the break room, others retreating into silence. The photograph that had spent decades forgotten in a metal trunk had now divided an entire institution. As Anna packed her notes that evening, she wondered if truth was worth the cost. Looking at the faces in the photograph once more, she knew it was. As the internal debate dragged on at the National Archive, a new threat emerged from the shadows. Far-right extremist groups began targeting the institution on social media, accusing Anna Müller and her colleagues of distorting German history and dishonoring their ancestors. What had begun as an academic discovery was rapidly transforming into a political firestorm. Dr. Matthias Weber called an emergency meeting after receiving several threatening emails. "They know our names," he announced grimly, his usual bureaucratic demeanor replaced by genuine concern. "Security will be doubled effective immediately." Anna watched silently as armed guards began patrolling the archive's entrance. That evening, she discovered her professional profile had been flooded with hateful comments, some containing thinly veiled threats. The young intern sat alone in her apartment, trembling as she scrolled through message after message, each more vitriolic than the last. "Perhaps we should pause the investigation," she suggested to Marta Klein the following morning, her voice barely above a whisper. "Just until things calm down." The genealogist squeezed her hand. "That's exactly what they want. Fear is their most effective weapon, always has been." Despite Marta's encouragement, doubt crept into Anna's resolve. She had never imagined that uncovering historical truth would put her physical safety at risk. That night, she considered abandoning the project altogether, packing her belongings and returning to her parents' home in Munich. But as she prepared to email her resignation, Anna found herself rereading the testimonies from Eichenheim families. One passage from Günther Schneider particularly struck her. "For 75 years, I've carried this silence like a stone in my chest. Before I die, I want someone to know what happened to us, even the ones who look like perfect Germans." The elderly survivor's words cut through her fear. Anna remembered walking through Eichenheim's cobblestone streets, seeing the descendants of those who had been forced to kneel in that photograph, families who had lived under the weight of unspoken history for generations. Dr. Otto Braun found her the next morning already at her desk, surrounded by documents. "I thought you might not come back," he said quietly. "Someone has to speak for them," Anna replied, not looking up from her work. "Even if it costs me something." The supervisor nodded, sliding a security access card across the desk. "The restricted archives. There's more there about those soldiers. Be careful who sees you using this." As Anna took the card, she understood that her personal safety might be compromised. But the moral obligation she had undertaken when she first opened that iron chest remained unshaken. Some truths demanded to be told, no matter the price. Time was running out. Researchers from universities across Europe and America began flooding the National Archive with requests to access the photograph. Major newspapers from London to Warsaw published speculative articles, demanding answers about what they called Germany's hidden persecution of its own. Anna Müller and her small circle of allies felt increasingly cornered. Dr. Otto Braun had secured them a private office away from prying eyes, but the pressure was mounting daily. Security guards now patrolled the archive's entrance after several threatening calls. Another email from The Guardian, Anna sighed, rubbing her tired eyes, and 3 more requests from historians in France. Dr. Braun placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. We knew this would happen once word got out, but remember why we started this. Despite the mounting pressure, each new discovery strengthened their resolve. That afternoon, they uncovered military tribunal records showing that one of the soldiers in the photograph had been court-martialed for excessive sympathy towards subjects of inspection. A euphemism that suggested not all German soldiers had blindly followed orders. This changes everything, Anna whispered, carefully scanning the fragile document. It proves there was resistance even within the system. Later that evening, as they organized their findings, Marta Klein grew unusually quiet. The genealogist had been examining a list of denounced families when her hands began to tremble. My grandmother's maiden name was Weiss, she finally said, voice barely audible. She never spoke about the war. But my mother once mentioned that someone had reported her for suspicious activities in 1943. Anna looked up, surprised. You never told me. I never told anyone, Marta replied. Growing up, we learned not to ask questions about that time. But seeing these documents, these names, her voice broke. She could have been one of those women forced to kneel. Anna moved closer, taking her colleague's hand. What had begun as professional cooperation had transformed into something deeper, a shared mission born from personal stakes. That's why this matters, Anna said firmly. Not just for history books, but for families like yours who never got answers. Dr. Matthias Weber appeared at their door, his expression unreadable. For a moment, Anna feared he'd come to shut down their project. Instead, he placed a folder on their desk. Transportation records, he said quietly. From Ickenheim to the eastern camps. I found them in the restricted section. He hesitated. My father was stationed near there. He never spoke of it either. As he left, Anna and Marta exchanged glances. Their small alliance was growing, bound by threads of personal history none had expected to confront. After 8 months of painstaking investigation, the National Archives Board finally reached a historic decision. Dr. Matthias Weber stood before his team, his voice steady despite the tension visible in his shoulders. The photograph and all associated documents will be released to the public, he announced, accompanied by a comprehensive dossier detailing the context of our findings. Anna Müller felt her heart racing as she exchanged glances with Marta Klein across the room. The genealogist gave her a subtle nod of solidarity. This moment represented everything they had fought for against seemingly insurmountable odds. The news spread throughout Germany with remarkable speed. Major newspapers ran front-page stories about the Ickenheim revelation, as it came to be called. Television programs invited historians to discuss the implications of discovering that Nazi persecution had extended even to those considered ethnically German. This changes our understanding of how the regime maintained control, explained Dr. Otto Braun during a press conference. Standing protectively near Anna as cameras flashed, it wasn't just about targeting obvious minorities, it was about creating an atmosphere where anyone could be denounced. Public reaction split dramatically. Academic institutions and human rights organizations praised the archive's courage in confronting uncomfortable truths. Letters of support flooded in from survivors and their descendants, thanking them for bringing hidden stories to light. Yet there was backlash too. Right-wing groups organized protests outside the archive, claiming the institution was shaming the nation and reopening wounds best left closed. Anonymous threats arrived daily, forcing security measures to be heightened around the building and key staff members. Anna felt a complicated mixture of relief and fear. Walking home one evening, she noticed a car following her for several blocks before it turned away. That night, she double-checked her locks before calling Marta. Was it worth it? She asked her friend, who had become her closest ally through this ordeal. Ask the families in Ichenheim, Marta replied softly. Ask your own conscience. Despite the controversy, Anna knew they had done the right thing. The photograph that had once been buried in a dusty iron chest now stood as testimony to the complex reality of life under totalitarianism, how neighbors became enemies, how arbitrary denunciations destroyed lives, and how the machinery of oppression ground forward regardless of blood or heritage. As she finally drifted to sleep, Anna thought about Günther Schneider and the other survivors, who could now see their experiences acknowledged in the historical record. Their truth had finally been heard, and no amount of backlash could silence it again. The cobblestone square in Ichenheim glowed with the soft light of hundreds of candles on that cool autumn evening. Descendants of those captured in the photograph had gathered from across Germany, some traveling hundreds of miles to honor relatives whose stories had been buried beneath decades of silence. The modest ceremony, organized by the town council, marked the first public acknowledgement of what had happened in their community during those dark days of 1944. Anna Müller stood near the edge of the crowd, watching as elderly residents placed photographs beside the candles. The young intern felt a profound sense of purpose as she observed families reclaiming their narrative. Beside her, Marta Klein dabbed at her eyes, the genealogist's professional detachment finally giving way to emotion. "My grandmother would have been here," Marta whispered, squeezing Anna's hand. "She would have been proud of what we've done." The scent of fresh bread wafted across the square from Grunwald Bakery, now run by the third generation of the family. They had opened their doors late, offering warm loaves to those attending the memorial. This simple act of community seemed to bridge past and present in a way that formal speeches could not. A gentle rain began to fall, but no one moved to leave. Instead, umbrellas opened like black flowers across the gathering. Under the shelter of an ancient linden tree, Günther Schneider, now 89, sat in a wheelchair surrounded by young people. The elderly man's voice was soft but clear as he shared memories of neighbors who had disappeared overnight, of whispered warnings, and of the day the soldiers came to take photographs. "We were told it was for documentation," the old man explained to his rapt audience. "Only later did we understand it was meant to intimidate, to show what happened to those who didn't conform." Anna watched as teenagers recorded his testimony on their devices, their faces solemn with the weight of history. What had begun as her solitary quest in a dusty archive had blossomed into this moment of collective remembrance. Mayor Hoffman stepped forward, reading aloud the names of those who had been persecuted. With each name, a family member stepped forward to light another candle. The simple ritual transformed statistics into human lives, each flame representing a story reclaimed from obscurity. As the ceremony concluded, residents approached Anna and Marta, pressing small tokens into their hands, old photographs, handwritten recipes, pressed flowers from gardens that had witnessed history unfold. These weren't just gifts, they were fragments of memory entrusted to the women who had helped break 75 years of silence. In that moment, standing in the rain-washed square, Anna understood that history wasn't just preserved in archives, it lived in communities brave enough to face their past. The photograph of the 3 Nazi soldiers spread across news outlets worldwide within days of its public release. Major universities in London, Paris, and New York immediately organized conferences to discuss its implications. What had started as Anna Müller's persistent investigation in a dusty Berlin archive had now become a watershed moment in Holocaust studies. This single image has forced us to reconsider the breadth of Nazi persecution, explained a prominent historian from Oxford during a televised interview. It wasn't just about targeting obvious minorities. It was about absolute control through fear, even among those considered part of the master race. Anna watched these developments from her small apartment, overwhelmed by the scale of what she had unleashed. Her phone buzzed constantly with interview requests from journalists and documentary filmmakers. The young intern who had once been afraid of losing her position was now being hailed as a hero by some and vilified by others. Dr. Matthias Weber, initially reluctant to support the investigation, now stood firmly behind the findings. At a press conference, the director of the National Archive acknowledged both the courage and academic rigor Anna had demonstrated. Sometimes, he admitted, the most important historical discoveries come from questioning what we think we already know. Textbooks across Europe began, including the photograph and its story. Museum curators integrated the findings into their exhibitions, creating special displays that explained how the Nazi regime maintained control through community surveillance and arbitrary punishment. The image of those kneeling civilians became as recognizable as other iconic wartime photographs. For Marta Klein, the genealogist who had become Anna's closest ally, the vindication was deeply personal. "My grandmother would have been proud," she whispered to Anna during a quiet moment between meetings. "Her story is finally part of the larger narrative." Perhaps most significantly, universities began establishing research grants specifically for uncovering hidden histories within their own archives. Young historians cited Anna's work as inspiration for digging deeper into seemingly settled historical accounts. Dr. Otto Braun, who had quietly supported Anna from the beginning, presented her with a bound collection of letters from scholars around the world, acknowledging her contribution. "You've reminded us all that history isn't just about the big events," he told her. "It's about the everyday moments of courage and cruelty that often go unrecorded." Exhausted but fulfilled, Anna realized that her persistence had not just uncovered one forgotten incident. She had helped create a new framework for understanding how totalitarian regimes function, not just through dramatic public displays of power, but through the quiet, insidious destruction of community trust and human dignity. Back in Berlin, Anna Müller carefully placed a copy of the photograph in her personal archive, alongside a handwritten thank you letter from the residents of Ichenheim. The weight of the past 8 months settled on her shoulders, not as a burden, but as a testament to what determination could uncover. The truth had come at a significant cost: sleepless nights, professional scrutiny, and even threats from extremist groups. "Was it worth it?" Dr. Otto Braun asked, finding her alone in the archive's reading room. The young intern looked up, her eyes reflecting both exhaustion and resolve. "Every moment," she replied without hesitation. Dr. Matthias Weber had finally come around, acknowledging that institutions existed to preserve truth, not bury it. He'd even nominated Anna for a prestigious historical research award, noting how her work had forced historians worldwide to reconsider the reach of Nazi terror within German communities themselves. Marta Klein joined them, carrying fresh coffee. The genealogist had become Anna's closest ally and friend through the investigation. Together, they had given names and dignity back to families who had been erased from official narratives. "My grandmother would have been proud of what we accomplished," Marta said quietly. She always believed silence was the greatest weapon of oppression. Outside the archive's windows, Berlin continued its bustling pace, a city that had learned to confront its past rather than hide from it. The photograph of the 3 soldiers and kneeling civilians had become more than just an image. It was now a powerful teaching tool in schools across Europe. Anna thought about Günther Schneider and the other elderly residents of Ekenheim, how their eyes had filled with tears when decades of shame and confusion were finally given context and validation. Some wounds could never fully heal, but acknowledgement was its own form of justice. That evening, as Anna packed her desk, her internship now complete, she found a small envelope. Inside was a job offer from the National Archives' new Department of Historical Reconciliation, created in response to her discoveries. The journey had transformed everyone involved. Dr. Weber had found courage, Dr. Braun had rediscovered purpose, and Marta had connected with her own family history. As for Anna, she had learned that history wasn't just about documenting the past. It was about listening to its whispers, especially those that had been deliberately silenced. In the end, Anna Müller understood a profound truth. No matter how deeply buried, the voices of the past will always find a way to be heard. They simply need someone brave enough to listen.